Hi again. I wanted to spend some time today to talk to you about our use case. We are a group called Accelerated Discovery, which is actually part of IBM Research, so a little bit different than your line side of the business. We are focused on a couple things. Really, one, looking at scientific workloads and how to improve overall the output and how we're engaging here. Why is this important? So we just went through a pandemic. That was fun. And we got a vaccine pretty rapidly because of a tremendous amount of application of scientific compute to the fundamental problem of evaluating and identifying materials, small molecule, large molecule drugs, a variety of other targets and modes of operation. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing there, and then we'll talk about why we're using Dapr to do this ultimately as well. So what is accelerated discovery? Fundamentally, discovery, for the most part, could fall into two fundamental categories. One would be the application of what we would think of as, say, wet chemistry, so the process of evaluating and experimenting and mixing targets, reagents, synthesis, the like, and that works pretty well. We've been doing that for well over 100 years, but it's slow. So most of scientific discovery is moving in silico, meaning we're using digital simulations of all aspects of the process and approach, and we'll talk a little bit about what those mean and how it works. We also are trying to better instrument the measurement of the outcome of the work that we do. So how do we effectively articulate the benefit to, say, the patient or the consumer or a variety of other categories? So where is this relevant? It's relevant in all kinds of places. So we work with key partners to do things like better understand what materials are appropriate for things like carbon sequestration, so literally pulling carbon out of the air. We work on understanding the overall biome and impact of our climate choices in nature. We look at overall improvement of the genetic stock and targeting of agricultural products. We look at antimicrobial films or formats. We also look at things like scenarios where we're evaluating specific drugs to handle specific outcomes. But what's common amongst all these different applications is fundamentally the idea that we need to be able to apply the scientific process appropriately and get a good sense of where we're going with this. And this should look familiar to you from high school. This sequence and flow is really the ability to evaluate, come up with some ideas, test them, assess them, report them, and drive them in many cases. And we're really going through the process of delivering that as an overall target. Science works. There's no question about it. We're here. We're not stuck at home for that exact reason right now. But it takes lots of years and lots of money to develop a new material or drug in today's format. Our goal is to really drive that down to a scenario where we can improve by an order of magnitude at minimum. And we're looking at extending past that point as well. So why is science hard? So the rate of scientific information and data generation is vast. So it's many different parties who contribute to this. It's technologists, it's scientists, it's commercial organizations, it's national labs, it's health organizations, it's governments. And this body of information represents a tremendous amount of input that we have to think about as we go through this process. There are fundamentally vast possibilities here too. So if we look at the known number of active compounds, there's 10 to the 63 possible active compounds that may apply in these contexts to the type of structure or work that goes into this overall. Simply finding the thing that matches the thing is a problem space unto itself that we have to think about. The cost and time of research and validation, I've talked to a bit. The computational limits are real, right? So pentacene, C22H14, you're seeing here is literally the biggest molecule that can be accurately simulated. And simulation, by the way, takes many different formats as well. So in today's world, we have a variety of perspectives and approaches, some naive. So when I say naive, I mean knows little about the context. So if you look at things like Roberta, GPT-3, a lot of these other scenarios where we're using the fundamental language and description of chemistry to work through this process, those are great, and we call those AI surrogate simulations. So the idea there is that we generate a model that reflects a specific set of inputs, but it can't be generalized on a scientific basis. The next level up from that is to use our early version of physics called Newtonian physics to help describe this. So really think of that as a mechanical simulation of, say, a material or a drug or whatever the target might be. And it might be very specific. We might look at the interaction of a docking site, which is how a protein bonds to a ligand or an attractor that is expressed in this context. And then beyond that, you have what you would think of as quantum mechanical simulation. So you start thinking about Schrodinger's equation. You start thinking about how we describe the probabilistic nature of matter and how you can articulate that. And that includes not just the simple idea of how these things might bond, but the context as well. So no drug is combined with in your body in isolation. There's usually water and other materials there. We have to simulate all those as well. And then finally, we do work on top of that where we have the most accurate method of defining observables of molecules, which is describing them within their actual quantum state on a quantum computer. So the capacity to define literally the observable energy states of matter as part of that is really well expressed in that format as well. So we're pulling all those pieces together in an interesting context. And oh, by the way, people really think the state is important. So they would like it protected, they would like it interpreted correctly, and they want to know it's safe when we're working through this stuff. I personally think it's a good idea. So how do we do that? We're mixing what we're starting to call a science cloud with some artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So we have a scale of options to execute this type of work when it comes down to it. What that means is that I just mentioned 4 different types of simulations, and that's just one part of the process. How do I know which one to use best to solve these problems? At which stage is it economical for me to apply those? And we're moving more and more towards this idea of being able to support what we're calling computational steering. So the concept that as you describe and execute the workload, you build a body of metadata that can help interpret and give you an understanding of the right fit of compute to that process. And there are ways to overall improve that. We've also worked a ton on things like lower precision analog AI accelerators as part of this too. So you can bring in additional hardware. There's hardware that's specifically good at massive matrix multiplication and other linear algebraic operations that you can apply in that case. So we're mixing a lot of these pieces together. So we have the fundamentals we need to handle. We know that science is complex, but it's automatable. We know artificial intelligence is powerful, but we need to select the right method to use it. And we know quantum computing is nascent and growing and represents some really interesting options in terms of accurately reflecting the quantized nature of matter as part of that story. So let's talk about AI for accelerated science for a second. There's a lot going on there, and there's many different ways to approach this. In the early days, we were looking at this as an option to apply an expert system. So really a sequence of events that had conditional logic to apply to a scenario. We would run these, evaluate the outcome, again, try to apply it and work through that. In the last era, machine learning, especially around things like hyperdimensional curve fitting and a variety of other categories that look interesting in this case, give you a chance to work through that process. And that was good, but also somewhat limiting. And then what we're seeing more and more now in this scenario is we're looking at a case where we have massive amounts of labeled data, and we apply compute, and we do things like deep learning, which is much more iterative and adaptive, as you probably know. So how do we do that? Just a quick example. We have things like a product that we're looking to generate, and we have reactants and reagents we use to combine and build that product. That process is called synthesis. And we have some very fundamental interpretations of this. And chemistry has its own language. The sequence of letters you see below is something called a Smiles string that describes the overall structure in a sequence that we can process. Good news is because it's a language, it's pretty easy to apply something like NLP to this to do some good work. But it is fundamentally like translating from one language to another when you're doing the operation rather than simply combining the two to make a sentence. So it is more complex than you would see otherwise. But that basis for language gives us a lot of options to do interesting things. So you combine that with what I mentioned before, all of that information we generate in that space, and we do something that's quite interesting, which is instead of indexing documents and materials that are coming out of, say, Nature papers or the archive or a lot of other areas, we're building a set of fundamental descriptors that give you properties and interpretations of those cases. So I might say, I'm looking for a small molecule ligand that can dock with this specific receptor baseline. And I want it to be able to work within this temperature range, and I want it to be able to work in an aqueous solution. So those are example parameters we might pull out. I might go look through the total database of the 10 to 63 options I mentioned, and I'm probably not the first person to do that. Someone else might own the patent to that, or someone else might have tried it and it didn't work. I want to know what the baseline looks like in terms of each of those cases and how we can better distribute and understand those scenarios. So we're looking for what we affectionately call the latent patent space, typically to do this. Drug companies and other folks often will start a project, establish a baseline or an understanding of a specific technique or art, file for protection for that IP, and then put it on the shelf. And I need to know if that's there or not in many of these cases. So there's many different ways to do that. So we essentially use the overall knowledge in this scenario that helps us describe basically the existence of certain targets and areas that we can do it, but essentially we're pulling properties out of the total volume of scientific information to inform what we should look for as part of that story. Very often, once we have that molecule that makes sense, we're going to go and do what we talked about with AI simulation for modeling. So we're going to pick those model types that we're talking about: a surrogate model, a mechanistic model, an ab initio quantum mechanical model, or an actual quantum simulation as part of that, and decide what happens there. And the whole art to that is that as you go up that scale, things get more expensive. The idea of essentially simulating the overall target of a quantum mechanistic model is a tremendous amount of compute. Generally, we're in the tens of thousands of cores, or hundreds, if not thousands, of GPUs that we're applying to these problems, and they're running for a week, 2 months in these situations. So you're throwing down some serious cloud spend, just to be clear, as part of that. So how do we get those? How do we figure out what's a good candidate if we have those properties that I mentioned earlier? So we say, hey, this one looks pretty good. I think I want these properties. I want to be able to do what we're calling a generative scientific discovery using AI. So I can take those properties in those SMILE files and say, given these fundamental rules, evaluate the search space that exists underneath those so that you can get a sense of exactly what would make sense in this case. And you start with a wide net and drop this down. You may have seen stories in the news about someone using generative AI like this to come up with 40,000 new options for chemical weapons, which is also an upside and a downside to this. But in many of these cases, you can generate things that are potentially applicable, but they have to be bounded by honest, direct, and morally centered goals, first of all. Second, anytime someone's generating 40,000 candidates, it means that their criteria is pretty loose and it's probably not going to work anyway. But it's definitely a different spin. So generative technology has a real big upside, which is it speeds and gives you candidate molecules to test as part of that. But it definitely drives in this case. We also have started to accelerate overall the idea of once we have those candidates and the perspective, we've automated the process of generating the recipe or the synthesis process that's necessary in this case too. So we'll take a target molecule, we'll take their reactant and reagent and their combination and break them out into a set of instructions that can be executed by a robotic prototyping lab. So we have the small scale version, really like the home kit that we have at IBM, but most commercial sites will have a robotic lab about half the size of this room that can do all kinds of things like select the nature and environment, everything from vacuum to high heat, to simulate reactions as part of that story. We have a tool that's online and actually also open source called RxN, which is a synthesis and retrosynthesis package that gives you the capacity to do some of these for free as part of that. So I talked about quantum computing a couple times. Quantum computing is a nascent space. It's a growing space, and it's inherently a limited space currently in this scenario. But there are some fundamental interesting examples as part of this. There are a lot of hard problems, even NP hard problems that we face every day in overall computing context that have some really interesting options in terms of potential developed targeting with quantum systems. So there's really a couple of categories. So there's the simulation of quantum systems. So the physics, the chemistry, and the material science. I talked a little bit about that. You really can, because a quantum computer represents its calculable space as a defined set of potential and kinetic energies in a closed system. That ironically is the same way you would describe the energy state of a molecule. So it matches perfectly. Funny enough, you use the substrate of the universe to calculate things. The universe is compatible as part of that story. Algebraic problems like machine learning and differential equations and factoring, somewhat interesting, but in many cases we're just learning how to use these pieces because the development of overall quantum systems today is moving in that direction. And then search problems. So, things like a random walk that you might see as a typical algorithmic scale in this space also has a quantum equivalent that uses probability rather than path definition to solve in this case as well. The good news is that almost all of these, aside from factoring, some other fun stuff, are really very applicable to applied science in the immediate sense. We're doing a lot to try to push this along. We have the capacity to do core simulations of molecular state today, but they are limited by the capacity of the quantum system. So as the biggest we've got thrown around right now from a qubit perspective right now is the Eagle, which is 127 qubits. That's not enough to do anything as large as, say, caffeine. So lithium hydride works great, but more complex molecules are still out of scope of a single quantum computer. Now, that just means that we're learning how to do interesting things like break up problems and distribute them to multiple quantum computers. So we're starting to see the birth of things like distributed quantum computing. So not just by classically sending different parts of the problem to other computers, but by using entanglement and entangled state to distribute work across these systems as well. So that's kind of where we're starting to go from that perspective. So let me give you some very specific examples so you get a sense of what this looks like. Photoresistant materials. So why is this interesting or relevant? So photoresistant coatings are generally used to lay down a pattern of etching that you might put on a piece of silicon to make chips. And higher quality photoresistant materials give you the capacity to do better chip design. Most of the chips that are produced today are not just 2D etchings on a flat plane, but they're three-dimensional. So being able to adjust depth of burn when you're developing a chip is really important to be able to do this. Josephson junctions that for the quantum systems themselves are complex three-dimensional designs, for example, low yield, really hard to make, and tough in that part. We do make chips, so this is something kind of near and dear to us. So we had a goal, which was let's find some candidates for photoresistant material that can decrease environmental impact and essentially drive the state of the art from a microelectronic perspective. We pulled together the combination of things we talked about, right? We looked through the current corpus of papers and materials and got a good sense of where we were going in terms of desired properties. We took those properties and put them into the generative modeling system to come back with some candidates. We ran that a couple times. We kind of joke that this is actually a form of molecular Tinder, basically, that you go through where you evaluate swipe right or swipe left based on the combination of trade-offs or properties that you might see in a set of molecule types in this case. And we go through the process of evaluating those pieces. Once we get to the point where we've got some good candidates, we start that chain of simulations that we talked about, just enough to convince us that it would be a good idea to potentially evaluate these pieces. So we'll start with something very naive, like an NLP model, to evaluate whether this is going to work. Then we'll go to the mechanistic model, which makes some fundamental assumptions. So like I mentioned water. Water is an air or dramatic things because they're made of molecules. They interrupt everything, right? Just because we can't see them and we think they're normal as humans, they're all part of the chemical process as part of the story. So there's this idea of an implicit solution, meaning you generalize the properties of water when you do the simulation, or explicit, which is you literally model the molecules of air or water that interface with the interaction you're going for, and it's part of that story. When you start to do the explicit version is when things get quite expensive. Another example, we partnered with Oxford to focus on antibiotic materials as part of this story. We looked at a scenario where we were trying to find and establish some simple and non-harmful ways to build antimicrobial materials for medical applications and a few others. In these situations, what we're trying to do is simulate the effect of material A connecting with material B and what happens. So this is often a case where you're not just looking at the structure of the molecule, but the molecular dynamics as part of that story. In this case, we, as an example, went through the same process. Instead of the 2 to 4 years the traditional approaches were yielding, we were looking at a scenario where we're closer to 45 days, 48 days actually, as part of that story. Same story here with polymer membrane discovery. So polymer membranes sound pretty unpleasant until you realize that things like metal organic frameworks and polymer membranes are exactly what we're going to need to use to pull CO2 out of the air, the water, et cetera, as part of this story. So carbon sequestration is a real focal point for us in general in this category. And being able to quickly walk through a set of potential options with those materials is pretty key to that process. So we essentially start to evaluate and target each of these cases, pull these pieces together, and drive this, and this is another generative use case. Right, geological CO2 storage, I think, is generally the way to extend this as well. In these kinds of scenarios, we're looking at cases where rather than simply capturing the carbon, what do we do with it? Well, we can put it back in the ground, is part of the suggestion here in this case. So this gets a little bit more interesting because you're not talking about just a random material, but you're talking about an overall geological structure, the substrate, the rock itself, what the interpretations is, and how that can work. And we'll do flow dynamic simulations on top of simply the molecular scale work in this case. So in each of these applications, we're chucking around pretty big chunks of data. So the rock library here is about 5 terabytes of modeling read that we used and load into a distributed simulation every time we do some work. That essentially can be interesting by itself, but it's really about driving those cases. We also partner with some folks to do things like improve the overall strategy for pain management, especially in cases where you're looking for non-pharmacological methods of pain management. So we partner with Boston Scientific on some work for implantable pain management, so essentially neurostimulators that get installed in someone's spine to help drop the overall effect by essentially sending canceling signals to the patient as part of that. We have a set of, we take in the raw sensor data from this implantable, but we also look at overall quality of life. We take input in the form of things like voice, text, other interpretations, and we run them through a set of psycholinguistic services that evaluates patient mentality, state, and target. We combine that with quantitative data from the device itself, and we're able to rank and structure patients into what you would think of as patient state categories. Do you need to improve? Are you on the upswing? Are you on the downswing? And we use this generally to help inform decisions around patient care and treatment as part of that story as well. So it's a powerful package. And we've seen a tremendous amount of improvement by looking at all these ultimate data sources as potential options to drive those. Now, every single data source, as you saw in some of the earlier presentations, represents a data challenge that you have to work through as part of that story. And it's really what we're going from that perspective. So how do we do all this stuff? We've put together this discovery platform that focuses on combining those three things we mentioned: AI, quantum computing, and Science Cloud. And we pull together in that context the idea of generative science, hybrid simulation and modeling, and overall digital science. In the cases I showed you, digital health as a focal point in that case. So our platform essentially is a combination of a couple of these tools. The other thing that you have to realize in this case is that none of these things are static. I might sit down with a partner scientist, and we will come up with a new method for quantum mechanistic simulation that will be coded directly as part of that story and interpreted as part of that. So this is, again, a great example of an extensible developer platform that's focused on a fully portable SDK that essentially brings its own compute as part of this scenario. So what's different here is Dapr is integrated into this overall control plane. This SDK and UI are all built on externally facing services that call internal Dapr services. But we've started to treat Kubernetes as a client to the system as well. So we have the capacity to spin up fairly large, 30, 40, 50 node, 1,000 to 2,000 CPU Kubernetes clusters for the express purpose of defining and executing one of these simulations in this case. And we leave that spun up for a short period of time. We manage the state at the SDK platform level from both the inputs and the simulation side and the outputs in terms of execution and the artifacts that were used to perform those calculations. So essentially think event source science is probably the best way to put it. And that gives us a whole backplane to drive that. So that lets us, because we've started to divorce the data payload and the execution payload from the infrastructure in this case, the option to very quickly play with some of the configuration baseline. So if we think we want to use something like a traditional MPI HBC function, we might grab that. If we think we want to use something that's a little bit more serverless, we'll grab an auto-scaling array cluster and attach that to the cluster as part of that story, or we'll fire off a variational quantum eigensolver on the quantum system as part of that story. But it gives us a tremendous amount of flexibility to do this, and we've started to open source this idea of what we're calling a bridge operator, which is the concept of something that you can load directly onto the control cluster that has awareness of all the fundamentals of each of those types of compute that I just talked about, and gives you the chance to essentially apply them and drop those pieces as part of that story. I'll talk about some of the open source stuff a little bit as well. Data infrastructure. So we use event pub sub and Dapr as the entry point for that. Absolutely. We don't require the user to know where their data is. We fundamentally think data gravity is lame and really push hard on that concept in the sense that we do a lot of essential replication to get the data to these workloads anyway. It's nothing stopping us from making sure that we're okay moving it from, say, an on-prem cluster at a national laboratory to a cloud in this case as well. And we use a lot of interesting things to do that. And there's been a lot of interesting advancements in that area, things like Skyplane and the like from Rise and a few others in that case too. So who is using this? The science itself, really this is where we ask the questions. What are some new candidate small molecule drugs for X? I don't know. in the RNA function, et cetera. What is the solubility of a new molecule in water? I mentioned that. That's actually more dramatic of a problem than you could anticipate. How do I better manage patients' pain? These are all fundamental questions. We have a scientist user today who works usually through a common set of UI. Now, that UI does not have to be a graphical user interface. One of the most popular ways to schedule and drive this is using implicit workflow, meaning bash scripts, and a lot of other interesting stuff. And scientists like their way of doing things. So we support access to these SDKs through what you would think of as traditional scheduled HPC-like activity, as well as things like your favorite workflow solution. Workflow is such a loaded term. I'm so excited that these guys are working on it, by the way, because it needs some work. But there's things like Balsam and a lot of other workflow solutions that people prefer, and people can get quite religious about workflow. So our solution to this problem is not to be in the way of that. We offer services that help that you can use to schedule data, compute, and operations for these scientific workflow with these scientific experiments. But we're not prescriptive about what workflow engine you run on. We personally use Kubeflow internally, but that's our choice, not anything else. As part of that. So typically what you're seeing is a clean SDK mapped on top of, say, something like Kubeflow that is calling Dapr that might be running at on our Amazon control plane cluster using resources that could span, some say the quantum data center at IBM or raw execution of HPC on Amazon, for example. Some example targets here. We might just do something like, hey, I'd like to train a generative model. I have a pipeline named because we have a catalog that, again, is a Dapr service that we pull out that gives you a view of all of the model types and artifacts that you can execute on. And you can call those, execute them, and drive it. In this case, we're training a generative model. We're defining an inference pipeline, meaning the thing that will produce the candidates we talked about, and then we'll run that inference pipeline and produce the candidates. So what are the key features of this? We are experimenting with that interesting space between the scientist power user, someone who's very comfortable in a clean Python API, probably understands functional programming and is comfortable in that area, all the way through to the traditional wet chemist who's working in the lab on a regular basis and wants to have a little bit more of a visual description of how things work in each of these cases as part of that. But fundamentally, we're able to do that rapidly because we have a single API backplane that is very focused on the functions as part of that story from the scientific perspective and not from the distributed compute perspective in that category. So what does this thing look like overall? We have a set of problem domains we've talked about. We have a set of the types of operations. So collect, integrate, and structure things. Typically, the nature of these things is not a database or another perspective. It's usually a graph. We generally try to encode and understand the overall structure and strategy of a scientific experiment more than we do the exact outcome, because we wouldn't be doing an experiment if we knew it was going to happen. In this case, the model and simulation areas are definitely part of that. We also, by the way, do a lot of work to try to determine which modeling and simulation technique works. So one of the key things that you generally run before you start this is a Bayesian optimization run of the parameters or features that you're looking to establish as part of that to determine whether you have the right ones or not. So this is a really pretty deep universe into itself. The insight and hypothesis area using the generative modeling framework is pretty important to that too. And then the digitization of the lab to be able to perform those test, synthesis, and retrosynthesis operations to determine whether you can even make the thing you just came up with is usually a good idea. So all those things surface as clean, defined APIs that use data coming from a single event-driven service in Dapr, operations that are described as internal viewpoints in this case, and we pull those pieces together. if you look on the left side, there's some great examples of that. So you might call the Python SDK from Kubeflow or any sort of notebooks. You might use the CLI for what I would call traditional HPC workflow. Or you might use a scientific workbench or a tool that we built or someone else did. We're not too prescriptive about that when it comes down to it. The Dapr user services level is really important. That gives us a really clean and concise way to perform that operation and access. Most of these services are asynchronous, so circuit breaking isn't really a huge issue right now, but we're moving in that direction. The nice part about it is I personally, from the product perspective, don't need to think about a lot of those scalar problems because I've got a lot of that. I've got a lot of faith in Dapr and the community and the team to think ahead of me in those cases. And then below that, there's the data services and the resource management side of this, where we do some interesting stuff. We use a data vault. So what that means is that we have a space that is HIPAA high-tech compliant and has its own GDPR controls, and we stick all critical data into that space. And when I do that, I get a token back out of that, and I never use sensitive customer information in any operation as part of this target. If I really need to figure out who that was, I can always go back to the data vault and go through a process to evaluate it, but it keeps our overall compliance cost to almost zero because sensitive information in the context of even medical applications can be isolated and prevented from interfering with the work. Because anything that slows us down costs us money, costs us time. It's part of that. We essentially keep an overall event log of any experiment you do. So if you want to go back later and work halfway through your simulation target and you decide you want to do a different type of simulation, you can replay the state of an experiment and get to the point where you can essentially start to do this. The other thing this gives us, which is new and something that a lot of the scientific community is looking at right now, is the capacity to do totally portable workflows. Now, some of these operations are stochastic, meaning they don't always repeat the exact same way every time, but the process you can repeat exactly in this context. And why would you want that? There's a big push in the scientific community to essentially make sure that if you are publishing something, especially if you're working from a grant that's government funded, either in the US or other areas, that you're completely transparent. You're using open source software. If you generate any IP, it goes into open source. If you're defining the data that's part of this input, it is published, and that your experiment is repeatable. It's very tempting, not saying everyone does this, but it's very tempting to publish the outcome and to potentially decrease the fidelity of the recipe, if you will. So it tastes a little bit like what you're describing, but it's a way for organizations to retain some control over public information. By using a platform like this, you can start to mandate and enforce the option of transparency and repeatability for critical science workflows and targets. That's really, in my opinion, really important when it comes to overall benefit at a societal level rather than simply profit as a target. All of those features and capabilities are easy to do in this context because Dapr offers the services available to do that. It has a clean and easy way to do event-driven management of this data set. It gives you a really strong capacity to isolate and pull boilerplate out of a lot of these implementation and targets as part of that, and puts us in a great place to do this. So our team has been together for about 6 months, and we're pushing out our first early access release of this platform. Well, we did it last week at this point, but we're really quite excited. And I can't stress enough that the context of developer velocity, the capacity to remove the fundamental concerns around distributed computing. Notice I didn't have to talk about contention. I didn't have to talk about scalar functions or any of these other distributions, yet we're throwing around large amounts of data across multiple contexts. And that's 100% due to Dapr's ability to work in this flow and scenario. So we're really pleased to do it. Things I'm really excited about. there was an issue that there was a proposal that went up for cross-cluster calls and operations. This, for me, is yet another magical moment where right now I can't, because of the exotic nature of some of the compute we use, dictate that everything ends up in one place. Having the capacity to connect to and operate as if there's one backplane across multiple clusters in this context really drives down the complexity of what I need to do to achieve my goals. But this is just an example of the kind of surprises you get from the Dapr community from my viewpoint. So we're really pleased to be here and part of this exercise. We do not like the idea that this type of approach stays in the hands of, candidly, the private sector. So we've partnered with NumFocus, who's the group that does, common scientific libraries like NumPy, SciPy, and a couple of these others, in something we're calling open source science. Open source science is focused on this idea of, establishing a baseline to recontribute most of the tools we're using to do this. In this case, to drive those categories. So we're participating with a good set of partners to make sure that the work we do is something that can be repeated in an academic and non-commercial context as well as otherwise, regardless of whether you have access to 2,000 GPUs or not as part of that story. So we're really excited to make sure that this is a part of the story and key to us. So we had a bit of a launch in July on that one. So that's what I had for you guys today. I just wanted to give you an example of a different flavor of workload or target that Dapr is enabling and the method and flow. But I don't know, how are we? Yeah, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer anything anyone has. Yes?
So I was actually really interested in your the process of actually modeling a lot of these biological events. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I was curious about, though, is how do you actually account for the unknown downstream interactions with different drug candidates in your models, because you don't actually know what those downstream metabolites are going to be. So how do you account for that in the model outside of just something naive like just water?
So water is an easy example, but when you're talking about a drug, you're usually talking about a ligand, which is usually something like a metal ion that is almost like the key to the lock, which is a docking site in a protein, which is a place where proteins can combine and connect. So great example of that in a practical sense is something like the spike protein in COVID. Someone had to figure out the proper ligand to dock with that as part of that story, and then they had to get your mRNA to generate that protein. But in many of these cases, you're not just evaluating your specific docking site as part of that story, but you're also looking at a common set of known toxicity levels for these targets. So one of the guys that worked for me spent a good bit of time looking at mRNA-generated vaccine toxicity levels with a very similar approach, but looking for side effects in that scenario. So like I mentioned, I'm simplifying this a ton, but you're generally looking at primary, secondary, and long-term bonding effects for molecular interactions. And that's where molecular dynamics is so valuable in these cases, is because as long as you can parallelize these efforts, you can evaluate a lot of different methods of efficacy as part of that story in this case. So yeah, the drug has to work, but it can't work in an unintended way as well, for sure. But yeah, that's where you probably want to go to the level of targeted molecular dynamics evaluation versus using GPT-3 to evaluate it. Yep.
Do you have an example of data volume that is processed in the platform that you showed before?
Some examples. So some of the data volumes we use can vary tremendously. So pretty recently, we licensed a data set for a patient cohort that was approximately 175 million people at something like the rate of, I think it's like 60 to 80 attributes per person. So it was a 5 terabyte, 7 terabyte baseline data set. And that was specifically designed to do something really simple, which was to define the cohort of application for an evaluation we're doing as a start. When we're talking about things like omics or genetics in general, you're talking, generally in the tens to hundreds of gigabytes as a baseline, and then you have to multiply that by the number of types of operations, because there's many different forms of evaluation similar to that story that you do. So there's epigenetics, metagenetics, normal sequence sets and the like, and weirdly enough, lab equipment always doesn't get the best samples, so you're doing a lot of interesting things as part of that. And then things like the pain evaluation, that's a data stream that doesn't stop, right? So, in general, we're looking at that as a constant flow multiplied by the target. The other thing that we're doing, by the way, is that we're doing some interesting stuff in what we're calling hybrid modeling, where you can take a feature set in machine learning that describes a specific state of a patient when they have a known condition, and you can generalize that so that you can observe a patient based on that feature set, and then it's called inverse stochastic modeling, where you can essentially predict what the outcome is based on that feature set. So any data you can get, voice, video, otherwise is interesting from that perspective too. But that boils down to being able to see a video of someone walking down the street and tell whether they're going to have a heart problem or not, based on that kind of target. So you're talking about large volumes of data that has a derive and flow as part of that too. So it's pretty big. And then the compute side, you're typically looking on average on a discrete evaluation of experiment of thousands to tens of thousands of units of compute. For the most part, especially if you're later in the stage and you're looking at efficacy, you're really broadening it.
I think you're going to have a speaker on now.
All right, thanks.